The dust kicked up by Rose Whitfield's worn boots had long since settled on the prairie grass behind her. But the ache in her feet told the story of miles walked under the merciless August sun. Her calico dress, once a respectable shade of blue with tiny white flowers, now bore the stains of 1,000 hardships, mud from creek crossings, salt from her own tears, and the inevitable yellow dust that seemed to coat everything in this God-forsaken territory. She paused at the crest of a low hill, shielding her eyes with a gloved hand that had seen better days. The leather was cracked now, split at the knuckles from work she'd never imagined doing back in Philadelphia. Below her stretched a valley dotted with cattle, and at its heart stood a ranch house that looked solid enough to weather any storm the plains could throw at it. Smoke curled from the chimney in a lazy spiral, and Rose felt something twist in her chest, something that might have been hope if she'd had any left to spare. Silver Creek Ranch. She'd heard the name whispered in the last town, spoken with a mixture of respect and wariness that made her curious. The woman at the general store had lowered her voice when she mentioned it, glancing around as if the walls had ears. "Jonathan Mallister's place," she'd said. "Keeps to himself, that one. Been alone since his Martha passed. 3 years back now. Some say he's gone half wild out there." But wild or not, Rose needed work, and she'd exhausted every other possibility within 50 miles. Her fingers found the small cloth pouch tied inside her dress. $3.67, enough for maybe a week's worth of bread and beans, if she was careful. After that, she pushed the thought away and started down the hill toward the ranch. The yard was neat but spare, with the kind of order that spoke of a man who did everything himself, and did it well. A black and white border collie emerged from behind the barn, tail wagging tentatively as it approached. Rose extended her hand, and the dog sniffed cautiously before allowing a gentle pat. "That's Ranger," came a voice from the shadows of the front porch. "He's got better manners than most folks." Rose straightened, her hand instinctively smoothing her skirts as a man stepped into the afternoon light. He was tall, taller than her father had been, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of winter sky. There was something about the way he held himself that spoke of military service, a bearing that even civilian clothes couldn't quite disguise. His shirt was clean but patched, his boots worn but well cared for, and when he looked at her, she felt as though he was cataloging every detail without making her feel like a specimen under glass. "Mr. Mallister?" Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected. "I'm Rose Whitfield. I'm looking for work." He said nothing for a long moment, just studied her with those pale blue eyes. Rose forced herself to stand straight despite the exhaustion that made her bones feel like lead. She'd learned that showing weakness was an invitation for trouble, especially for a woman traveling alone. "What kind of work?" His voice was rough, as if he didn't use it much for conversation. "Any kind you need doing," she said, and meant it. "I can cook, clean, keep books, tend a garden. I've got a fair hand with mending, and I'm not afraid of hard work." "Where'd you come from?" The question was simple enough, but Rose felt the weight of everything she'd lost pressing down on her shoulders. "Philadelphia, originally. My family." She swallowed hard. "My parents passed last winter. Consumption took them both. The bank claimed everything we had for debts I didn't even know existed." She didn't tell him about the weeks in the boarding house, watching her money disappear a penny at a time. Didn't mention the men who'd made offers that weren't really offers at all, or the night she'd climbed out a second-story window rather than pay her rent in ways that would have destroyed what little dignity she had left. Some stories were too raw to tell a stranger, no matter how desperately she needed his help. "So you came west," he said. It wasn't a question. "So I came west." She lifted her chin. "I'm not asking for charity, Mr. Mallister. I'm willing to earn my keep." Jonathan, and she found herself thinking of him by his first name, though she hadn't given herself permission to, walked down the porch steps with the measured pace of a man who never moved without purpose. He circled her slowly, and Rose fought the urge to fidget under his scrutiny. She'd been looked over like livestock before, and it never ended well. But there was something different in his assessment. He wasn't looking at her the way men usually looked at women, with calculation or desire or dismissal. He was looking at her hands, noting the calluses that hadn't been there 6 months ago. He was seeing the careful mends in her dress, the practical way she'd pinned up her honey-colored hair, the stubborn set of her jaw that said she'd rather die than beg. "This isn't Philadelphia," he said finally. "Out here, winter can kill you if you're not prepared. Work means getting up before dawn to milk cows, means carrying water from the well when your back feels like it's breaking, means going to bed too tired to think. It means dealing with rattlesnakes and coyotes and men who think a woman alone is fair game for whatever they have in mind." Rose met his gaze steadily. "I figured as much. I'm still asking." Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or approval. He was quiet for so long that Rose wondered if he'd forgotten she was there. The sun was sliding toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose that reminded her painfully of better times. Soon it would be dark, and she'd have to find somewhere to spend the night. The thought of another night sleeping rough, of starting over again in another town with even less money, made her stomach clench with something that wasn't quite fear but wasn't far from it. "I've got conditions," he said abruptly. Relief flooded through her so suddenly she felt dizzy. "Yes, sir, whatever they are." "You don't know what they are yet. I know I don't have anywhere else to go." He studied her face for another long moment, and Rose had the unsettling feeling that he could see straight through to her soul. When he spoke again, his words hit her like a physical blow. "I'll give you work," he said slowly, "but only if you'll be my wife before the sun sets." Rose stared at him, certain she'd misheard. The world seemed to tilt around her, and she put out a hand to steady herself against the porch railing. "I beg your pardon? You heard me right." His voice was matter-of-fact, as if he'd asked her to pass the salt. "Marriage, today, before dark." But you don't even know me." The words came out as barely more than a whisper. "I know enough." He gestured toward the valley spread out before them. "I know you've got grit enough to make it this far on your own. I know you're desperate enough to ask a stranger for work and honest enough not to lie about why you need it. That's more than I can say for most folks." Rose felt the blood drain from her face. "Mr. Mallister, I'm grateful for the offer of work, but marriage, that's not what I came here seeking. It's what I'm offering." He turned away from her, looking out over his land with an expression she couldn't read. "I need a wife more than I need a hired hand. Miss Whitfield, the land office is breathing down my neck about the North Valley claim. They want to see a family settled there, not just a lone man playing at farming. Without a wife, I lose everything my father spent his life building." The calculation in his words should have offended her, but Rose found herself understanding the brutal practicality of it. This was frontier country, where survival often trumped sentiment and desperate people made desperate bargains. "What would you expect from such an arrangement?" she asked carefully. "A wife in name," he said, still not looking at her. "Someone to help run the household, to stand beside me when the land agents come calling. Beyond that," he shrugged, "we'd figure it out as we went along." Rose closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her circumstances settle around her like a trap. $3.67. No family, no friends, no prospects. Winter was coming, and with it the kind of cold that could kill a person who had nowhere warm to sleep. When she opened her eyes, Jonathan was watching her again, his expression unreadable. "The sun sets in about 4 hours," he said quietly. "That's how long you have to decide." Rose looked at him, really looked at him, trying to see past the weathered exterior to the man beneath. He wasn't cruel, she thought. Hard, certainly, and lonely in a way that went deeper than just missing company. But there was something in his eyes that spoke of honor, of a man who kept his word even when it cost him. "If I said yes," she heard herself asking, "what would happen to me if you changed your mind? If you decided you'd made a mistake?" "I don't make mistakes like that," he said simply. "When I give my word, It stands. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of hay and horses and something indefinably masculine that made her think of safety, of protection, of belonging somewhere again. Rose had been drifting for so long that the idea of having a place, any place, to call home, made her chest tight with longing. "I need time to think," she said. "You've got it." He stepped back toward the house, then paused. "There's coffee on the stove if you want it. And Miss Whitfield, whatever you decide, you're welcome to supper and a bed for the night. I'm not the kind of man who turns away someone in need." As he disappeared into the shadows of the porch, Rose sank down onto the steps, her legs suddenly too shaky to hold her. Ranger padded over and laid his head on her knee, as if sensing her turmoil. The sun continued its relentless journey toward the horizon, each minute bringing her closer to a decision that would change everything. In the distance, cattle lowed and settled for the evening, and smoke from the chimney painted gray ribbons against the darkening sky. 4 hours to decide the rest of her life. Rose buried her face in her hands and tried to find the courage to choose. The clock on the mantelpiece showed 6:30 when Rose finally rose from the porch steps, her decision crystallizing like ice on a winter pond. The smell of beef stew had been drifting from the kitchen for the past hour, and her empty stomach had been making its complaints known with increasing urgency. But hunger wasn't what drove her to knock on Jonathan's door. It was the cold, hard mathematics of survival. "Mr. Mallister?" she called through the screen door, her voice steadier than her hands. "I've made my decision." He appeared in the doorway, wiping his hands on a dish towel that had seen better days. Up close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the way his dark hair was touched with silver at the temples. He was older than she'd first thought, perhaps 35 to her 23, but there was a solidity about him that spoke of dependability, of a man who would weather whatever storms came his way. And the single word carried no pressure, no expectation. He would accept whatever answer she gave, she realized. And somehow that made her choice feel less like surrender and more like partnership. "I accept your proposal." The words came out in a rush, before courage could abandon her entirely. "But I have conditions of my own." Something flickered in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or approval. "Name them." "I want your word that you'll treat me with respect, regardless of the circumstances that brought us together. I won't be spoken to like hired help or treated like property." She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze directly. "And if either of us finds this arrangement unsatisfactory, we'll discuss it honestly rather than letting resentment fester." Jonathan studied her for a long moment, then stepped back to let her into the house. The interior was clean but sparse, furnished with pieces that looked handmade and built to last. A woman's touch was evident in small details, embroidered curtains that had faded with age, a quilt draped over the back of a wooden chair, a china shepherdess on the mantelpiece that seemed too delicate for its surroundings. "Martha's things," he said, noticing her gaze. "I haven't had the heart to pack them away." Rose nodded, understanding. Grief had its own timeline, and she wasn't here to replace his first wife. She was here to help him keep the land that Martha had loved. "Your terms are fair," he continued, turning to face her fully. "And I'll add one of my own. Honesty. We're strangers entering into something that'll bind us until death do us part. If we're going to make this work, we need to be able to speak plainly to each other." "Agreed." She hesitated, then forced herself to ask the question that had been gnawing at her. "You mentioned that other women have been here before me. What happened to them?" Jonathan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. 3. Over the past year. The first one took one look at the isolation and ran back to town before I could even explain the situation. The second listened to my proposal, ate my food, then slipped away in the night with my spare horse and what little cash I kept in the kitchen tin. And the third made it as far as the preacher's parlor before she changed her mind, said she couldn't go through with marrying a man she didn't love. He shrugged, but Rose caught the flash of pain in his eyes. Can't say I blamed her for that. Rose felt something unexpected stir in her chest. Not quite sympathy, but understanding. Love is a luxury some of us can't afford, she said quietly. But respect and partnership, those are things that can grow given time and patience. My thoughts exactly. He moved toward the kitchen, gesturing for her to follow. We should eat before we head to town. Judge Thompson won't appreciate being called out after dark, but he'll do it if the price is right. The stew was simple but well seasoned, and Rose found herself eating with more appetite than she'd had in weeks. Jonathan was quiet during the meal, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. He seemed to be a man who thought before he spoke, who weighed his words carefully before giving them voice. There's something else you should know, he said as she helped him clear the dishes. The North Valley claim, it's not just about proving I'm settled with a family. There are complications. Rose paused in her wiping of a bowl, sensing the weight behind his words. What kind of complications? The kind that involve men with more money than scruples and a willingness to use force to get what they want. His expression darkened. Bartholomew Caldwell owns most of the land from here to the county seat. He's made it clear that he considers the North Valley to be his, regardless of what the land office papers say. A chill ran down Rose's spine that had nothing to do with the evening air. And you think marrying me will change his mind? I think it'll give us legal standing that's harder to challenge. A married man with a homestead claim carries more weight than a bachelor trying to hold on to his father's dream. He turned to look at her directly. I won't lie to you. Rose, there's danger in this. Caldwell's not above using intimidation, and there have been incidents with folks who've stood in his way. Rose set down the bowl with hands that trembled only slightly. She'd fled from one kind of danger in Philadelphia only to walk into another here in the territories. But at least this danger came with a choice, with agency, with a man who was being honest about the risks. What kind of incidents? Barns burned, cattle scattered, wells poisoned. His voice was grim. Nothing that could be traced back to him directly, but the message was clear enough. And you still want to go through with the claim? My father spent 15 years clearing that land, building on it, making it into something worth having. I'll be damned if I'll let some snake in a fancy suit steal it from under me. The quiet steel in his voice told Rose everything she needed to know about Jonathan Mallister's character. He was a man who stood his ground, who honored his obligations, who would fight for what was his. The question was whether she was brave enough to stand beside him. How long do we have to establish the claim? She asked. 6 weeks. The land office wants to see evidence of a permanent settlement, a house, cleared fields, a family and residence. He paused. Without a wife, they'll rule against me. With one, he shrugged. We'll have a fighting chance. Rose nodded slowly, pieces falling into place. It wasn't romance that had prompted his proposal. It was desperation wrapped in pragmatism. She could respect that. She could work with that. Then we'd better get married, she said. The ride to town took 40 minutes on horseback, with Rose riding side saddle on a gentle mare named Belle, while Jonathan led the way on a sturdy gelding. The evening air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and stars were beginning to appear in the vast Montana sky. Rose found herself thinking of her parents, wondering what they would make of this turn in her fortunes. Her mother had always said that life had a way of providing what you needed, even if it didn't look like what you wanted. Judge Thompson lived in a white-painted house on the edge of town, with a garden that his wife tended with obvious pride. The judge himself was a portly man in his 60s, with kind eyes and silver whiskers that needed trimming. He listened to Jonathan's request with the weary patience of a man who'd presided over countless frontier marriages born of necessity rather than affection. "You're certain about this, young lady?" he asked Rose, his gaze gentle but searching. "Marriage is a serious business, not to be entered into lightly. I understand the gravity of it. Your Honor," Rose replied, "Mr. Mallister and I have discussed the arrangement thoroughly." Mrs. Thompson appeared with a bouquet of late-blooming roses from her garden, pressing them into Rose's hands with a motherly smile. Every bride should have flowers, she said firmly, ignoring her husband's raised eyebrows. The ceremony itself was brief and businesslike. Rose spoke her vows in a steady voice, promising to honor and cherish a man she'd known for less than a day. Jonathan's responses were equally measured, his calloused hand warm and firm as he slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, Martha's ring. She realized, though he didn't say as much, when Judge Thompson pronounced them husband and wife. Jonathan turned to face her with an expression she couldn't quite read. The kiss that sealed their union was brief and formal, more a business transaction than a romantic gesture. But Rose felt something shift between them nonetheless. For better or worse, she was no longer alone in the world. "Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Mallister," the judge said, making notations in his record book. "May your union be blessed with happiness and prosperity." As they rode back toward the ranch under a canopy of stars, Rose found herself studying her new husband's profile in the moonlight. He'd given her his name, his protection, and a place to belong. In return, she'd given him the legal standing he needed to keep his father's legacy alive. It wasn't love, but it was a beginning. And for the first time in months, Rose Whitfield, now Rose Mallister, allowed herself to hope that beginnings might be enough. The first light of dawn crept through unfamiliar curtains, and for a moment Rose forgot where she was. The bed beneath her was softer than anything she'd slept on in months, the quilts warm and smelling faintly of lavender soap. Then memory rushed back, the hasty wedding, the awkward ride home, Jonathan's quiet, "Good night, Mrs. Mallister," as he'd shown her to what had once been Martha's sewing room. She'd lain awake for hours listening to the sounds of the house settling around her, trying to reconcile the fact that she was now a married woman to a man whose favorite color she didn't even know. Through the thin walls, she'd heard Jonathan moving about in what she assumed was the main bedroom, the creak of floorboards and the soft thud of boots being set aside. The knowledge that he was so close, that she was now bound to him by law and custom, had made sleep elusive despite her exhaustion. Now, as golden light filtered through the gingham curtains, Rose forced herself to rise and face her new reality. She had no other clothes besides what she'd worn yesterday, so she shook out her travel-worn dress and pinned up her hair as best she could without a proper mirror. The small looking glass above the washstand reflected a face that looked older than her 23 years, marked by the trials of the past months, but not broken by them. The sound of voices from the kitchen drew her attention. Jonathan's familiar baritone mixed with two others she didn't recognize. Rose smoothed her skirts and steeled herself for whatever came next. First impressions mattered on the frontier, where trust was hard-won and suspicion came naturally. The kitchen was larger than she'd expected, with a massive cast-iron stove that radiated comfortable warmth and a long wooden table that could seat 8. 3 people looked up as she entered. Jonathan, a small elderly woman with silver hair twisted into a neat bun, and a lanky man perhaps 10 years older than her new husband, with graying hair and kind eyes set in a weathered face. "Rose," Jonathan said, rising from his chair with the courtesy that seemed ingrained in him. "I'd like you to meet Hattie Crow and Elias Brennan. They help keep this place running." The woman, Hattie, studied Rose with sharp blue eyes that seemed to catalog every detail from her worn boots to her hastily pinned hair. There was no hostility in her gaze, but no warmth either, just the careful assessment of someone who'd seen too much of life to trust easily. "So, you're the new Mrs. Mallister," Hattie said, her voice carrying the faint trace of an Irish accent. "I was beginning to think Jonathan would never find someone willing to take him on." Elias chuckled, a sound like gravel in a tin can. "Hattie's been trying to marry him off for 3 years now. She's got opinions about bachelors and their housekeeping. I've got opinions about men who think beans from a can constitute proper nutrition," Hattie retorted, though there was affection in her tone. She turned back to Rose. "I suppose you'll be wanting to know how things are run around here. I'd appreciate any guidance you can offer," Rose said carefully. "I'm used to working, and I want to pull my weight." Something shifted in Hattie's expression. Approval, perhaps, or at least a willingness to reserve judgment. Well, that's a start. Martha used to say that a woman who's afraid of work has no business being a rancher's wife. The mention of Jonathan's first wife hung in the air like morning mist. Rose felt the weight of comparison settling on her shoulders, but forced herself to stand straight under it. She wasn't here to replace Martha. She was here to forge her own path. "What needs doing first?" she asked. Hattie's eyebrows rose slightly. "Well now, most new brides expect to be waited on for at least a few days." "I'm not most new brides," Rose replied simply. Jonathan was watching this exchange with interest, his coffee cup halfway to his lips. Elias grinned and slapped his knee. "I like her already. John, she's got backbone." "The chickens need tending," Hattie said after a moment. "Eggs gathered, feed scattered, coop cleaned. After that, there's bread to be baked and vegetables to be brought in from the garden. The washing needs doing. And someone should check on the milk cow. Bessie's been acting poorly lately." Rose nodded, mentally cataloging the tasks. It was more work than she'd done in a single day since leaving Philadelphia. But it was honest work, productive work, work that would help justify her presence here. "I'll start with the chickens," she said. "I'll show you where everything is," Jonathan offered. But Rose shook her head. "You must have your own work to attend to. I'm sure Hattie can point me in the right direction." Hattie's lips twitched in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "The hen house is behind the barn. Feeds in the blue tin by the door. Watch out for Henrietta. She's got a mean streak and she's not fond of strangers." As Rose made her way toward the barn, she felt 3 pairs of eyes watching her go. She knew she was being tested, measured against some invisible standard that Martha had set. The knowledge should have made her nervous, but instead it strengthened her resolve. She'd survived the loss of everything she'd ever known, traveled halfway across the country with little more than hope to sustain her, and married a stranger to secure her future. A temperamental hen seemed like a manageable challenge by comparison. The hen house was a sturdy structure that spoke of Jonathan's careful craftsmanship. 24 hens pecked and clucked in the enclosed yard, with a magnificent rooster standing guard like a feathered sentinel. Rose approached cautiously, speaking in the soft, soothing tones her mother had used with their own chickens back in Philadelphia. Henrietta, a large red hen with suspicious eyes, squawked indignantly when Rose reached for the eggs in her nesting box. But a gentle but firm touch convinced her to move aside. By the time Rose had finished gathering eggs and scattering feed, she'd managed to establish a tentative truce with the flock. The milk cow, Bessie, proved to be a gentle Jersey with soulful brown eyes and an udder that looked uncomfortably full. Rose had milked cows before, though not recently, and it took her several minutes to reestablish the rhythm. Bessie was patient with her fumbling, and eventually the milk began to flow in steady streams into the pail. "She likes you," came Jonathan's voice from behind her. Rose didn't turn around, focusing on maintaining the steady pressure needed to keep the milk flowing. "How can you tell?" "She hasn't tried to kick you yet. That's more than she did for the last woman who tried to milk her." "Maybe she just needed a gentle touch," Rose suggested. "Maybe." There was something in his tone that made her glance over her shoulder. He was leaning against the barn door, his arms crossed over his chest, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You're full of surprises. Mrs. Mallister." The name still sounded strange to her ears, but she was beginning to like the way he said it, with a hint of respect that hadn't been there the day before. "I told you I wasn't afraid of work," she said, returning her attention to Bessie. "Saying it and proving it are different things. Hattie's impressed, and that's not easy to do." Rose finished milking and stood, stretching muscles that protested the unfamiliar position. "She seems like a good woman." "How long has she been with you?" "Since I was knee-high to a grasshopper. She came west with my parents when they first claimed this land, buried my mother, helped raise me, held this place together when I went off to war." His voice grew quiet. "She's the closest thing to family I've got left." There was pain in those words, carefully controlled but unmistakable. Rose found herself wanting to ask about the war, about his parents, about the losses that had shaped him into the solitary man she'd married. But something in his posture warned her that such questions would not be welcome, at least not yet. "And Elias?" she asked instead. "My best friend since we were boys. Rode with me during the war. Came back here when it was over. He's got his own place about 5 miles north, but he spends most of his time here helping with the heavy work." Jonathan's expression softened slightly. "You'll find him good company. He's got more stories than a traveling preacher and twice as many jokes." They walked back to the house together, Rose carrying the milk pail and eggs while Jonathan carried the chicken feed. The sun was climbing higher now, painting the landscape in shades of gold and green that made Rose's chest tight with unexpected beauty. This land was harsh and unforgiving, but there was a majesty to it that she was beginning to understand. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of activity. Hattie taught Rose the quirks of the temperamental stove, showed her where supplies were kept, and guided her through the process of making bread that would feed a household of hard-working people. Rose's hands, soft from months of genteel poverty, began to blister from kneading dough and hauling water, but she didn't complain. Elias regaled her with stories of Jonathan's boyhood misadventures while she worked, painting a picture of a boy who'd been serious even then, but not without humor. She learned that Jonathan had built most of the ranch buildings himself, that he could gentle a wild horse better than anyone in 3 counties, and that he'd once walked 30 miles through a blizzard to fetch a doctor for a neighbor's sick child. "He's a good man," Elias said as he watched her hang laundry on the line behind the house. "Quiet, but good. He'll treat you fair if you give him the chance." "I believe he will," Rose replied, and realized she meant it. By afternoon, Rose's dress was damp with perspiration and her hair had escaped its pins to curl around her face in damp tendrils. Her hands were raw from lye soap and hot water, and her back ached from bending over washboards and garden beds. But there was satisfaction in the work, in seeing the results of her labor in neat rows of vegetables, clean clothes flapping in the breeze, and fresh bread cooling on the kitchen windowsill. Jonathan found her in the garden as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. She was pulling weeds from around the tomato plants, her skirts kilted up to keep them out of the dirt, when his shadow fell across her. "Hattie says you've done more work in 1 day than most women do in 3. He said. Rose sat back on her heels, pushing a strand of hair from her face with the back of her wrist. "I told you I wasn't afraid of work." "So you did." He studied her for a long moment, taking in her flushed face and dirt-stained hands. "You've got blisters." Rose glanced down at her palms, where angry red welts had formed from unaccustomed labor. "They'll heal." Martha used to say that honest work never killed anyone, but there's no shame in taking time to let your hands toughen up. There it was again, Martha's name, spoken with a gentleness that spoke of deep, abiding love. Rose felt a flicker of something that might have been jealousy, which surprised her. She had no claim on Jonathan's heart, had entered this marriage as a business arrangement. Not a love match, but sitting there in the garden with dirt under her fingernails and his dead wife's wedding ring on her finger. She found herself wishing things could be different. "I'll be fine," she said, returning to her weeding with perhaps more vigor than necessary. Jonathan was quiet for a long moment. Then, "There's something I need to show you tomorrow. Something about the North Valley claim that you need to understand if you're going to be part of this." Rose looked up, catching something in his tone that made her pulse quicken. "What kind of something?" "The kind that explains why I was desperate enough to marry a stranger," he said grimly. "The kind that might make you wish you'd stayed on that road and kept walking." Before she could ask what he meant, he turned and walked away, leaving Rose alone in the garden with a growing sense that her new life was about to become far more complicated than she'd imagined. The morning air carried the promise of rain as Jonathan saddled 2 horses in the barn, his movements quick and efficient despite the early hour. Rose had risen before dawn, her sleep troubled by dreams she couldn't quite remember, but that left her with a sense of unease. Something in Jonathan's demeanor the previous evening had warned her that today would bring revelations she might not be prepared for. "We'll ride out to North Valley," he said without preamble as she approached, her split riding skirt rustling against her boots. Hattie had found the garment in a trunk, another remnant of Martha's life, and though it was slightly too long, it would serve for today's expedition. It's about an hour's ride, but you need to see what we're fighting for. Rose nodded, accepting his help mounting the bay mare he'd selected for her. The horse was steady and sure-footed, with kind eyes that reminded her of Bessie the milk cow. What should I expect to find there? Jonathan's jaw tightened as he swung up onto his own mount, a powerful sorrel gelding that danced sideways with barely contained energy. The remains of a dream, he said grimly, and evidence of why some men will do anything to crush it. They rode in companionable silence for the first half hour, following a well-worn trail that wound through rolling grassland dotted with stands of cottonwood and oak. The landscape was breathtaking in its vastness, stretching endlessly toward mountains that rose like purple sentinels against the horizon. Rose found herself understanding why Jonathan's father had chosen this place, why he'd been willing to stake everything on its promise. As they climbed a gentle rise, Jonathan pulled his horse to a halt and pointed ahead. "There," he said quietly. "North Valley." Rose caught her breath. Before them spread a natural valley perhaps 2 miles long and half as wide, enclosed by low hills that would provide shelter from winter winds. A creek meandered through its center, lined with trees that were already beginning to show autumn colors. The grass was thick and green, perfect for grazing cattle, and the soil looked rich and dark where it had been turned. But it was the devastation that held her attention. Near the center of the valley stood the skeletal remains of what had once been a substantial house. Blackened timbers jutted skyward like the ribs of some massive creature, and Rose could see where flames had licked at stone foundations before being contained by rain or human effort. Scattered around the ruin were other signs of destruction: a barn reduced to charred rubble, fencing torn down and left in tangled heaps, what might have been a well filled with debris. "My God," she whispered. "What happened here?" Jonathan's face was carved from stone as he urged his horse down into the valley. Rose followed, her mount picking its way carefully over ground that still bore scars from whatever violence had taken place here. "My father started building here 15 years ago," Jonathan said as they approached the ruins. "This was going to be the main house, big enough for a family, with room to grow. He and my mother lived in a dugout while he worked on it, cutting timber from the hills, hauling stone from the creek bed." Rose could see it in her mind's eye. A young couple full of hope and determination, working together to build something lasting. The thought made her chest tight with sympathy for dreams cut short. "He got it about halfway finished before the first fire," Jonathan continued, dismounting near what had once been the front porch. "Lost everything except the foundation. Started over, worked for 2 more years getting it back up." His voice grew harder. Then came the second fire. Rose slid down from her horse, her boots crunching on debris that might have been glass or pottery. Up close, the destruction was even more devastating. She could see where someone had tried to save furniture, gouges in the ground where heavy pieces had been dragged clear of the flames. "And the third?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. "That was 5 years ago. My father was getting too old for the work by then, but he was stubborn, said no man was going to drive him off his own land." Jonathan's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "The fire took him along with the house that time. Smoke got into his lungs. He never recovered." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. "Someone has been deliberately destroying this place. 3 times, Jonathan confirmed. "Always at night, always when no one was around to see who did it. The first time, we figured it was lightning. Happens often enough out here. The second time raised questions. The third," he kicked at a piece of charred timber. "That's when we knew we had an enemy." Rose walked among the ruins, trying to imagine the life that might have been lived here. She found bits of china scattered near what had once been a kitchen, the blue and white pattern still visible despite the damage. A child's toy horse, carved from wood, and somehow spared by the flames. The metal frame of a rocking chair, twisted by heat but recognizable. "Why?" she asked. "Why would someone do this?" "Because North Valley is the finest grazing land in 3 counties," Jonathan said bitterly. "Because whoever controls it controls the water rights for everything downstream. Because Bartholomew Caldwell decided he wanted it, and he's not a man who accepts being told no." The name sent a chill down Rose's spine. She'd heard it mentioned in town, always in hushed tones, always with a glance over the shoulder as if the man himself might be listening. "Tell me about him," she said. Jonathan was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the mountains beyond the valley. "Came out here about 10 years ago with money from back east, Chicago, I think, or maybe St. Louis. Started buying up land, making offers folks couldn't refuse. Those who wouldn't sell," he shrugged. "Well, they often found reasons to change their minds." "What kind of reasons?" "The kind that involve dead cattle and burned barns, the kind that make a man wonder if his family will be safe if he doesn't cooperate." Jonathan's voice was flat, emotionless, but Rose could hear the anger simmering beneath the surface. "He's got a way of making his problems disappear without getting his own hands dirty." Rose walked to where the front door had once stood, trying to imagine stepping across the threshold into a home filled with warmth and laughter. Instead, all she saw was destruction and the bitter evidence of human greed. "But you're not giving up," she said. It wasn't a question. "This land is my inheritance. My father's blood and sweat are in every acre of it." Jonathan joined her at the ruins, his presence solid and reassuring despite the desolation around them. "I'll be damned if I'll let Caldwell have it just because he's got more money and fewer scruples." "What's your plan?" Jonathan was quiet for so long that Rose wondered if he'd heard her question. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of careful consideration. "The homestead law requires proof of settlement, a house, cultivated land, a family and residence. Caldwell's been fighting the claim through legal channels, arguing that no one actually lives here. He's right, so far." Jonathan gestured toward the ruins. "But if we can build a new house, get it occupied before the deadline, establish residency," he shrugged, "the law would be on our side. And he'll try to stop you. He'll try to stop us." Jonathan corrected. "You're part of this now. Rose, your name is on the marriage certificate, which makes you a legal claimant to this land. If something happens to me—" "Nothing's going to happen to you," Rose said fiercely, surprising herself with the vehemence of her response. When had she become so invested in this man's survival? Jonathan turned to look at her, something unreadable flickering in his pale blue eyes. "You sound like you mean that." "I do." The realization hit her like a physical blow. Somewhere in the past 2 days, this had stopped being just about survival and started being about something more. She cared about Jonathan, about his dreams, about the legacy his father had died trying to preserve. "This is my home now, too." They stood in the ruins of someone else's dream, the weight of responsibility settling between them like a shared burden. Rose found herself imagining what this place could become, a house filled with warmth and life, fields green with crops, children playing in the yard. It was a dangerous dream, she knew, built on the foundation of a marriage that was barely 2 days old and threatened by forces she didn't fully understand. But it was their dream now, hers and Jonathan's, and she discovered she was willing to fight for it. "When do we start building?" she asked. Jonathan's smile was the first genuine one she'd seen from him, transforming his weathered features and giving her a glimpse of the man he might have been under different circumstances. "We already have," he said. "By marrying me, by standing here with me, by choosing to stay, you've already started building something that Caldwell can't tear down with fire." They spent the rest of the morning exploring the valley, with Jonathan pointing out the best sites for a new house, the areas most suitable for farming, the natural features that made this land worth fighting for. Rose listened and asked questions, her mind already working on plans and possibilities. She'd run a household before her family's collapse. She understood about budgets and resources, about making do with less and finding creative solutions to practical problems. "We'll need lumber," she said as they examined a likely spot for construction. And nails, window glass, roofing materials. All of that costs money. I've got some saved. Jonathan said, not much, but enough for a start. We can cut our own timber from the hills, make do with less glass until we can afford more. How long before the deadline? 5 weeks. Rose felt her stomach drop. 5 weeks to build a house and establish residency? It doesn't have to be much, Jonathan said quickly. 4 walls and a roof, enough to satisfy the legal requirements. We can improve it later, after the claim is secure. 5 weeks. Rose had sewn elaborate gowns in less time, had organized charity events and dinner parties with shorter notice. But building a house from nothing? In the wilderness, while under threat from a man with unlimited resources and no scruples. We'll need help, she said. Elias will pitch in, and there are a few other neighbors who aren't afraid of Caldwell. But most folks... Jonathan shrugged. They're too scared to get involved. Rose nodded, understanding. Fear was a powerful motivator, and Caldwell had clearly used it effectively. But fear could work both ways, and she was beginning to formulate ideas about how to turn that to their advantage. As they prepared to head back to Silver Creek Ranch, Rose took one last look at the ruins of the old house in the afternoon light, with shadows lengthening across the valley floor. She could almost see the ghosts of the life that might have been, Jonathan's parents working side by side, building their future one board at a time. We'll build it back, she said quietly. All of it, the house, the barn, the life that should have been lived here. Jonathan moved to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. It won't be easy. Caldwell won't give up just because we're married. If anything, he might see it as more of a threat. Let him try, Rose said, surprised by the steel in her own voice. I've lost everything once before. I'm not about to let it happen again. As they rode back towards Silver Creek Ranch, Rose found herself planning and scheming, her mind racing with possibilities and contingencies. She'd married Jonathan to save herself, but standing in that ruined valley had changed something fundamental inside her. This was no longer just about survival. It was about building something worth having, something worth fighting for, something worth keeping, no matter what Bartholomew Caldwell threw at them. The sun was setting behind the mountains when they finally reached home, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to promise both beauty and bloodshed in the days to come. Rose dismounted in the barnyard, her legs stiff from the long ride, but her resolve stronger than it had ever been. Whatever came next, she would be ready for it. The storm had been building all afternoon, dark clouds rolling in from the western mountains like an advancing army. By evening, the air crackled with electricity, and the wind had picked up enough to rattle the shutters against the windows of Silver Creek Ranch. Rose stood at the kitchen window, watching lightning dance across the horizon while thunder rumbled in the distance like the growl of some massive beast. Bad one coming, Hattie observed, bustling around the kitchen as she prepared supper. Haven't seen clouds that black since the summer before last. Jonathan appeared in the doorway, his hair damp with the first scattered raindrops. He'd been working with Elias to secure the outbuildings and bring the cattle closer to shelter, preparing for what promised to be a fierce night. How bad do you think it'll be? Rose asked, noting the tension in his shoulders. Bad enough. He moved to the window beside her, close enough that she could smell the scent of rain and leather that seemed to cling to him. We'll likely lose some shingles, maybe a tree or two, but the house is solid. We'll weather it. His words were meant to be reassuring, but Rose caught the undercurrent of worry in his voice. She was beginning to learn that Jonathan Mallister was a man who prepared for the worst while hoping for the best. And if he was concerned about this storm, she should be too. The first heavy drops began to fall just as they sat down to supper. Venison steaks that Elias had brought from his own hunting, fresh bread, and green beans from the garden. The conversation was subdued, interrupted frequently by crashes of thunder that grew steadily closer. Stocks all secured, Elias reported between bites. Horses are in the barn. Cattle are in the near pasture where we can keep an eye on them. Nothing much more we can do but wait it out." As if summoned by his words, the storm broke in earnest. Rain began hammering against the windows with the force of thrown gravel, and the wind howled around the corners of the house like a living thing. Rose had lived through storms before, but there was something about the vast openness of this country that made the weather seem more violent, more personal. "I should check on the animals," Jonathan said, rising from the table as a particularly violent gust shook the house. "You should stay put," Hattie countered firmly. "That wind would knock you flat before you made it halfway to the barn." But Jonathan was already reaching for his slicker. "Won't take but a minute. Want to make sure the barn door is holding." Rose felt a flutter of anxiety in her chest. "I'll come with you." "No." His voice brooked no argument. "This isn't weather for a woman to be out in." Before Rose could protest, he was gone, swallowed by the storm. She moved back to the window, pressing her face against the glass, but could see nothing beyond the sheets of rain that seemed to turn the familiar yard into an alien landscape. "He knows what he's doing," Elias said quietly, joining her at the window. "Been through worse storms than this." Rose nodded, but couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just the storm. There was something else, some instinct that made her skin crawl with unease. 20 minutes passed, then 30. The storm showed no signs of abating, and Jonathan hadn't returned. "He should be back by now," Rose said, her voice tight with worry. Elias was frowning now too, checking the old pocket watch he carried. "You're right. Even if he had trouble with the animals, he'd have sent word." Hattie appeared at Rose's shoulder, her face creased with concern. Maybe he took shelter in the barn, decided to wait out the worst of it. But even as she spoke, a new sound cut through the howling wind, the terrified lowing of cattle in distress. Rose felt her blood turn to ice. "Something's wrong," she said, already moving toward the door. "Rose, don't!" Elias started, but she was already pulling on her cloak. "I'm not staying here while something happens to him," she said fiercely. "He's my husband." The words surprised her with their vehemence. When had Jonathan become more to her than just a convenient arrangement? When had his safety become so crucial to her own well-being? Elias grabbed his own coat and hat. "Then we go together." "Hattie, you stay here in case—" "I'll do no such thing," the older woman interrupted, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. "If there's trouble, you'll need all the help you can get." They stepped out into the maelstrom together, immediately soaked to the skin despite their protective clothing. The wind hit Rose like a physical blow, nearly knocking her off her feet, and the rain stung her face like needles. Visibility was almost zero, but she could see an orange glow in the direction of North Valley that definitely wasn't lightning. "Fire!" Elias shouted over the storm, pointing toward the ominous light. Rose's heart sank. In this weather, a fire could only mean one thing. Someone had set it deliberately, and if Jonathan had gone to investigate. They fought their way toward the barn, finding it secure but empty except for the horses, who were stamping nervously in their stalls. Jonathan's gelding was missing, which meant he'd ridden out into the storm. Given the direction of the fire, Rose had a terrible certainty about where he'd gone. "He went to North Valley," she called to Elias over the wind. "Damn fool," Elias muttered, but there was admiration mixed with his exasperation. "Course he did. Can't let them burn his father's dream without a fight. We have to help him. In this weather, we'd be more likely to get lost and make things worse." But Rose was already moving toward the horses, her mind made up. Then we'd better not get lost. The ride to North Valley was a nightmare of wind and rain and treacherous footing. Rose's horse slipped and stumbled on the muddy trail, and twice she nearly lost her seat when particularly violent gusts threatened to lift her bodily from the saddle. But fear for Jonathan drove her forward. That and a growing rage at the cowards who would use a storm as cover for their destruction. As they crested the final hill before the valley, the full scope of the devastation became clear. The frame house that Jonathan had been working on, the new beginning he'd hoped to build for them, was completely engulfed in flames. Even in the driving rain, the fire burned with an intensity that spoke of accelerants, of careful planning. And there, silhouetted against the inferno, was Jonathan. He was on foot, his horse nowhere to be seen, fighting to save what he could from the flames. Rose watched in horror as he darted close to the burning structure, emerging with an armload of lumber that hadn't yet caught fire. His movements were desperate, futile, like trying to empty the ocean with a teacup. "Jonathan!" she screamed, but the wind stole her voice. He must have sensed their approach, because he turned toward them, his face a mask of soot and fury illuminated by the firelight. Even from a distance, Rose could see that he was injured, favoring his left side, moving with the careful precision of a man in pain. She was off her horse before it had fully stopped, running toward him across the muddy ground. "Jonathan, what happened? Are you hurt?" "They came in the storm," he said hoarsely, his voice barely audible over the wind and flames. "3 of them, maybe 4, had the place doused with kerosene before I could stop them. Your horse, spooked by the fire, threw me and ran." He gestured helplessly at the blazing structure. 5 weeks of work, gone in 5 minutes. Rose looked at the inferno that had been their future and felt something dark and fierce rise up inside her. This wasn't just about land or money anymore. This was personal. Someone had come in the night like a thief, had destroyed what belonged to them, had hurt the man she was coming to care for more than she'd thought possible. "Did you see who it was?" Elias demanded, having to shout to be heard over the storm. "Too dark, too much rain, but I found this." Jonathan held up a silver button, the kind that might come from an expensive coat, torn off in the struggle when I tried to stop them. Rose took the button, turning it over in her palm. It was heavy, well made, with an intricate design that spoke of quality and wealth. Not the sort of thing a common ranch hand would wear. "Caldwell's men," she said with certainty. "Can't prove it," Jonathan replied bitterly. "Just like all the other times, no witnesses, no evidence that would hold up in court." "We don't need a court," Rose said quietly, her voice carrying a steel that surprised even her. "We need justice." Both men looked at her, something in her tone making them pause despite the chaos around them. In the firelight, with her hair whipping around her face and her eyes blazing with determination, Rose looked like an avenging angel. "Rose," Jonathan said carefully. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that Bartholomew Caldwell has been getting away with this because no one's ever fought back properly. Because people are afraid of him, afraid of what he might do." She lifted her chin, rain streaming down her face. "Well, I'm not afraid." "You should be," Elias said grimly. "Men have disappeared for crossing Caldwell. Families have been run out of the territory. Then maybe it's time someone stood up to him. Someone he won't expect." Rose's mind was racing now, plans forming with crystalline clarity. He thinks he's dealing with simple ranch folk who'll back down when threatened. He doesn't know what to do with someone who refuses to be intimidated. Jonathan caught her arm, his grip gentle but firm. "Rose, I appreciate the sentiment, but this isn't your fight. It became my fight the moment I married you." She interrupted. "The moment I saw what they did to your father's dream." She gestured at the burning house. "This is our home they're destroying, our future they're trying to steal," as if to emphasize her words. A particularly violent gust of wind sent sparks spiraling into the night sky, and part of the roof collapsed with a sound like thunder. Jonathan flinched as if he'd been struck, and Rose felt her heart break a little for the pain in his eyes. "We'll rebuild," she said firmly. "We'll rebuild bigger and better, and we'll make sure Caldwell knows that we're not going anywhere." "With what money?" Jonathan asked wearily. "This was everything I had saved. Without this house, without proof of settlement, we'll find a way." Rose's voice carried absolute conviction. "I didn't come this far, didn't marry a stranger and learn to milk cows and gather eggs just to give up now." Despite everything, the fire, the storm, the destruction of his hopes, Jonathan found himself smiling. There was something indomitable about this woman he'd married, something that refused to bend even in the face of overwhelming adversity. "You're sure about this?" he asked. "Because once we commit to this course, there's no backing down. Caldwell won't stop with just burning buildings." Rose looked at the ruins of what should have been their home, then at the man who'd given her a chance when she had nothing left to lose. "I'm sure." "Then we'd better get back," Elias said practically. "Nothing more we can do here tonight, and standing in this storm won't help anyone." The ride back to Silver Creek Ranch was accomplished in grim silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts. By the time they reached the house, the storm was beginning to abate, the worst of its fury spent, but Rose knew that the real storm was just beginning. As they stood dripping in the kitchen, warming themselves by the stove while Hattie fussed over Jonathan's injuries, a gash on his forehead and what looked like cracked ribs from his fall, Rose made a decision that would change everything. "Tomorrow," she said quietly, "I'm going to town." "What for?" Jonathan asked, wincing as Hattie cleaned the cut on his head. "To have a conversation with Mr. Bartholomew Caldwell," Rose replied, her voice carrying a dangerous sweetness. "It's time he met his new neighbor." The look Jonathan gave her was equal parts admiration and concern. "Rose, don't try to talk me out of it," she said firmly. "I've made up my mind." Outside, the last of the thunder rumbled away into the distance, and the rain began to gentle to a steady patter. But Rose knew that the real storm, the one that would determine their future, was just beginning, and she intended to be ready for it. The morning sun cast long shadows across the main street of Cedar Falls as Rose guided her mare toward the center of town. She'd left Silver Creek Ranch before dawn. Despite Jonathan's protests and Hattie's dire warnings about what she was walking into, but Rose had made up her mind, and 3 days of careful planning had given her the confidence she needed for what lay ahead. She wore her best dress, the dark blue wool she'd saved from her Philadelphia days, and had pinned her hair up in a style that spoke of education and refinement. The silver button from the night of the fire was tucked safely in her reticule, along with a few other items that might prove useful in the conversation to come. Cedar Falls was a town caught between its frontier past and its aspirations for respectability. The main street boasted a hotel with actual glass windows, a general store that carried goods from back east, and a bank that looked substantial enough to handle serious money. But the boardwalks were still rough-hewn planks, and the air carried the eternal sense of dust, horse manure, and unwashed humanity that marked every frontier settlement. Rose tied her horse outside Morrison's general store, noting the way conversations died as she passed. Word traveled fast in a small town, and by now everyone would know about the new Mrs. Mallister and the fire that had destroyed their hope of claiming North Valley. She could feel eyes following her as she made her way down the street, could sense the mixture of curiosity and sympathy that trailed in her wake. The hotel dining room was exactly what she'd expected, serviceable but trying for elegance, with white tablecloths that had seen better days and chairs that didn't quite match. Rose ordered coffee and positioned herself at a table near the window where she could watch the street while appearing to simply enjoy a quiet morning meal. She didn't have long to wait. Bartholomew Caldwell made an entrance that was clearly calculated for effect. He was a man in his 50s, Rose estimated, with the kind of carefully maintained appearance that spoke of money and power. His suit was perfectly tailored, his boots polished to a mirror shine, and his silver hair was styled in a way that managed to look both distinguished and slightly dangerous. When he smiled at the hotel clerk, Rose saw teeth that were too white and too perfect, like a predator showing its fangs. He moved through the dining room with the confidence of a man who owned everything he surveyed, nodding to various townspeople with the casual authority of a king acknowledging his subjects. Some nodded back with eager enthusiasm. Others looked away quickly, as if afraid to meet his gaze. Rose waited until he'd settled at his usual table, the best one in the room, naturally, before making her move. "Mr. Caldwell?" She approached his table with the kind of polite smile she'd perfected during her Philadelphia society days. "I'm Rose Mallister. I wonder if I might have a word with you? Caldwell looked up from his newspaper with the expression of a man interrupted from important business. His eyes were pale gray, the color of winter ice, and they assessed her with the cold calculation of someone appraising livestock. "Mrs. Mallister," he said, rising with exaggerated courtesy. "How delightful. Please, join me." He gestured to the chair across from him, his smile never wavering. "I was so sorry to hear about the unfortunate incident at North Valley the other night." Rose sat down, keeping her own expression pleasantly neutral. Unfortunate indeed, though I suppose these things happen in frontier country. "Oh, they do indeed." Caldwell's voice carried a hint of something that might have been amusement. "Storms can be so destructive. Lightning, you know. Terrible thing when it strikes just the wrong place." "Actually," Rose said, pulling the silver button from her reticule and placing it carefully on the white tablecloth between them, "we found this at the scene. It appears someone may have lost it during all the excitement." For just a moment, Caldwell's composure slipped. His eyes flicked to the button, and Rose saw recognition there before his expression smoothed back into polite interest. "How curious," he said finally. "It looks like quality workmanship. I'm sure whoever lost it would be grateful to have it returned." "I'm sure they would." Rose picked up the button and tucked it away again. "Of course, it would be difficult to return it without knowing who it belongs to." They sat in silence for a moment, each taking the other's measure. Rose had played similar games of verbal chess in Philadelphia drawing rooms, though the stakes had never been quite so high. But the principles were the same. Never show weakness, never give away more than you gained, and always remember that the person who lost their temper first was the person who lost. "You're not what I expected," Caldwell said finally. "And what did you expect, Mr. Caldwell?" "Someone more rustic. Jonathan Mallister isn't known for his sophisticated tastes." His smile turned slightly predatory, though I suppose desperation makes a man less particular about his choices. Rose felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her voice level. "On the contrary, I think my husband showed excellent judgment. After all, he chose a wife who won't be easily intimidated." "Intimidated?" Caldwell's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. "My dear woman, whatever gave you the idea that anyone would want to intimidate you? This is a civilized community. We settle our differences through legal channels and proper business practices." "How fortunate," Rose replied sweetly. "Then I'm sure you'll be happy to hear that we intend to rebuild immediately. In fact, we're planning something much more substantial this time. A proper house, worthy of the finest land in the territory." Something shifted in Caldwell's expression, a tightening around the eyes that suggested her words had hit their mark. "Building is expensive work, Mrs. Mallister, particularly when one faces the possibility of setbacks, fires, accidents, tragedies." Rose quoted his own words back to him, watching as his mask slipped another fraction. "Yes, I've heard that building can be dangerous work, but then, so can many things. Even something as simple as riding alone at night can prove hazardous for a man with enemies." The threat was delicately delivered, wrapped in the language of polite concern, but Caldwell heard it clearly enough. His smile became genuinely amused, as if he were enjoying the game more than he'd expected. "You're quite remarkable, Mrs. Mallister. I can see why Jonathan was willing to marry a complete stranger." He leaned back in his chair, studying her with new interest. "Tell me, what would it take for you to convince your husband that North Valley isn't worth the trouble? I'm a reasonable man, prepared to make a generous offer for what amounts to worthless scrubland." "Worthless?" Rose laughed, the sound carrying just a hint of steel. "Mr. Caldwell, we both know that land is worth a fortune to the right person. The question is whether you're prepared to pay what it's actually worth, or if you prefer to rely on more creative methods of acquisition. I believe in free enterprise, Mrs. Mallister, supply and demand, market forces, all perfectly legal and above board." "How reassuring." Rose rose from her chair, smoothing her skirts with deliberate precision. "Then I'm sure you won't mind if we invite some of those market forces to work in our favor." Competition is so healthy for business, don't you think? Caldwell's smile never wavered, but Rose caught the flash of something dangerous in his pale eyes. I do hope you're not overestimating your position. My dear, this territory can be unforgiving to those who bite off more than they can chew. I've found that fortune favors the bold, Mr. Caldwell, and I've also found that bullies only respect strength. She inclined her head with perfect politeness. Thank you for the illuminating conversation. I'm sure we'll be seeing more of each other in the coming weeks. As Rose left the hotel, she could feel Caldwell's gaze boring into her back like a physical weight, but she kept her spine straight and her pace unhurried, determined not to give him the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. Her next stop was the sheriff's office, a modest building that managed to look both official and slightly apologetic at the same time. Sheriff Amos Hartwell was a man in his 60s, with graying hair and tired eyes that had seen too much of human nature's darker side. He looked up from his paperwork as Rose entered, his expression already resigned. "Mrs. Mallister," he said, rising politely. "I heard about the fire. I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you. Sheriff, I wonder if you might have time to discuss what happened?" Hartwell gestured to a chair, but his movement suggested a man who already knew this conversation wouldn't end well. "I rode out yesterday morning to take a look. Didn't find much. Rain washed away any tracks, and there wasn't much left to examine." "What about this?" Rose produced the silver button again, watching Hartwell's face carefully. The sheriff took the button, turning it over in his weathered hands. She saw recognition flicker in his eyes, quickly suppressed. "Looks expensive," he said finally. "Could have come from anywhere, though storms blow all kinds of debris around. Even debris that matches the buttons on Bartholomew Caldwell's coat." Hartwell's face went carefully blank. "Mrs. Mallister, I'd be real careful about making accusations without proof. Mr. Caldwell's a respected businessman in this community. And what am I? Sheriff? You're the wife of a good man who's already lost more than his share." Hartwell handed the button back to her, his voice gentle but firm. "My advice would be to take whatever insurance money you can get and start over somewhere else, somewhere safer." Rose felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "Are you saying you can't protect law-abiding citizens? Sheriff, I'm saying I'm one man with a badge and a gun, facing problems bigger than either." Hartwell's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Caldwell plays by rules that wouldn't hold up in a court of law, but he's careful never to leave evidence that would get him convicted. And he's got friends in high places, territorial officials, judges, even some folks in Washington. Then the law is useless here? The law is what it's always been, only as strong as the people willing to enforce it and stand behind it." Hartwell met her eyes directly. "Right now, that's not very many people." Rose left the sheriff's office with a heavy heart, but a clearer understanding of what they were facing. Caldwell wasn't just a local bully. He was part of a larger network of corruption that reached beyond Cedar Falls, beyond even the territory itself. Her final stop was the general store, where she found Samuel Morrison restocking shelves with the nervous energy of a man under pressure. He looked up as she entered, his face brightening with relief. "Mrs. Mallister, good to see you. How are you and Jonathan holding up after everything?" "We're managing, Mr. Morrison. Actually, I wanted to talk to you about supplies for rebuilding." Morrison's face fell. "Ah. Well, now, that might be complicated." "Complicated how?" "Well, it's just that, you see..." Morrison glanced around his store as if checking for eavesdroppers. "Mr. Caldwell. He's got arrangements with most of the suppliers in the territory. Sometimes those arrangements include understandings about who gets served and who doesn't." Rose felt her temper beginning to fray. "Are you telling me you won't sell us building supplies?" "I'm telling you I might not be able to get them," Morrison said miserably. "And if I could, they might be more expensive than usual. Supply and demand, you understand?" "I understand perfectly." Rose's voice carried a frost that made Morrison flinch. And I also understand that there are other towns, other suppliers, other ways of doing business. Mrs. Mallister, please don't think. I think you're a good man caught in a bad situation, Mr. Morrison. But I also think you need to decide what kind of community you want to live in. Rose moved toward the door, then paused. When you've made that decision, we'll be at Silver Creek Ranch, still fighting, still building, still believing that right makes might rather than the other way around. As Rose rode back toward the ranch, she could see the battle lines forming with crystalline clarity. Caldwell had more than money and hired muscle. He had a network of fear and obligation that stretched throughout the community, but he also had weaknesses, and Rose was beginning to understand how to exploit them. The sun was high overhead when she finally reached Silver Creek Ranch, where Jonathan was waiting in the yard with an expression that mixed relief and anxiety in equal measure. "How did it go?" he asked, helping her down from her horse. "About as expected," Rose replied, then smiled with grim satisfaction. "But I think Mr. Caldwell is beginning to understand that he's dealing with something new." "And what's that?" "A woman who's got nothing left to lose and everything to fight for." Rose linked her arm through his, feeling the solid strength of him beside her. "And a community that's about to discover what happens when good people finally decide they've had enough." The war for North Valley was about to begin in earnest, and Rose Mallister intended to win it. The first shot shattered the kitchen window at midnight, sending glass cascading across the floor where Rose had been standing just moments before. She hit the ground hard, her heart hammering against her ribs as the sharp crack of rifle fire echoed through the darkness outside Silver Creek Ranch. "Get down!" Jonathan's voice cut through the chaos as he rolled from his bed in the next room, his bare feet hitting the floor with a thud that spoke of a soldier's trained reflexes. "Everyone stay low!" Rose pressed herself against the kitchen wall, her nightgown tangling around her legs as she tried to make sense of what was happening. The peaceful night had erupted into violence so suddenly that her mind struggled to catch up. Through the broken window, she could see muzzle flashes blooming like deadly flowers in the darkness, and the sound of men's voices shouting orders filled the air. "Hattie," she called out, crawling across the floor toward the older woman's room. "Hattie, are you all right?" "I'm here, child," came the shaky reply from the doorway. Hattie appeared, clutching a shawl around her shoulders, her face pale but determined. "Been through Indian raids before. This ain't much different." Another volley of shots peppered the house, and Rose heard the distinctive whine of bullets passing overhead. Jonathan appeared in the kitchen doorway, fully dressed now despite the speed with which he'd moved, a rifle in his hands and his face grim with purpose. "How many?" Rose asked, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. "Hard to tell in the dark. At least 6, maybe more." Jonathan moved to the broken window, keeping low as he peered out into the yard. "They've got us surrounded. Shots coming from 3 directions." The sound of splintering wood from the front of the house told them that someone was trying to break down the door. Rose felt a cold fury rise up inside her, overwhelming the fear that threatened to paralyze her. After everything they'd been through, after all the work and hope and determination, Caldwell's men had come to finish what the fire had started. "Where do you keep the ammunition?" she asked, surprising both Jonathan and Hattie with the matter-of-fact tone of her question. Jonathan stared at her. "Rose, you're not—" "Where?" she repeated, steel in her voice. "Cabinet by the stove," he said after a moment. "But you don't know how to—" "My father taught me to shoot when I was 12. Rose interrupted, already moving toward the cabinet. "Said a woman should know how to protect herself and her family." Her fingers found the wooden box of cartridges, and she felt a grim satisfaction at their weight. "I may be from Philadelphia, but I'm not helpless." The front door gave way with a crash that shook the entire house. Heavy footsteps echoed through the parlor, and Rose heard the distinctive jingle of spurs that spoke of men who'd spent their lives in the saddle. "Mallister," a rough voice called out. "We know you're in there. Come out peaceful-like and maybe we'll let the women live." Jonathan's jaw tightened, Like hell, he muttered, then raised his voice. This is my property. You're trespassing. A harsh laugh answered him. Not for much longer. It ain't, Mr. Caldwell's getting tired of waiting for you to see reason. Rose found herself thinking of the silver button, of Caldwell's cold smile in the hotel dining room, of his barely veiled threats. The man had finally decided that subtlety wasn't working and had moved to more direct methods of persuasion. Elias should be here soon, Jonathan said quietly, checking his rifle. He said he'd come by first thing in the morning to help with the rebuilding. It's past midnight, Rose pointed out. Morning's still hours away. Then we hold them off until he gets here. The sound of furniture being overturned in the parlor was followed by the crash of something heavy, probably Martha's china cabinet. Rose realized with a pang of grief for the memories being destroyed. These men weren't just here to drive them away. They were here to erase everything the Mallister family had built. Mrs. Mallister, the voice called again. You seem like a sensible woman. Talk some sense into your husband before this gets ugly. Rose looked at Jonathan, saw the grim determination in his pale blue eyes, and made her decision. Moving to the kitchen doorway, she called back, I'm afraid my husband and I are in complete agreement. You're not welcome here. A bullet splintered the door frame inches from her head, and Jonathan yanked her back into the kitchen. Are you trying to get yourself killed? I'm trying to show them we won't be intimidated, she shot back, though her hands were shaking now. They expect us to cower and surrender. Let's disappoint them. Hattie had found her late husband's old pistol and was checking the chambers with the competence of someone who'd done it before. Always said this house was built to withstand trouble, she muttered. Solid walls, good sight lines. We can hold them off if we're smart about it. The next few minutes passed in a blur of gunfire and shouted commands. Rose found herself at one of the side windows, using Jonathan's instructions to sight down the barrel of a rifle that felt both familiar and foreign in her hands. When she saw movement in the yard, a dark figure creeping toward the house with obvious malicious intent, she squeezed the trigger without hesitation. The recoil knocked her backward, and the sound was deafening in the confined space of the kitchen. But through the ringing in her ears, she heard a cry of pain from outside and saw the figure stumble and fall. Good shot, Jonathan said grimly, firing his own rifle through the broken front window. That'll make them think twice about getting too close. Rose's hands were steadier now, the immediate danger burning away her fear and leaving only cold determination. She'd been tested by poverty and loss, by the necessity of traveling alone across dangerous territory, by the challenge of building a new life from nothing. This was just another test, and she refused to fail it. How long can we hold out? She asked, reloading with movements that were becoming more confident. Depends on how badly they want us gone, Jonathan replied, and how much they're willing to risk to make it happen. His answer came in the form of a burning brand thrown through the broken kitchen window. The flaming torch landed near the stove, and Rose saw the immediate danger as flames began to lick at the dry wooden floor. Fire! Hattie cried, already moving with a bucket of water she'd had the foresight to fill. Rose grabbed dish towels and began beating at the flames while Jonathan continued to fire at the attackers outside. The acrid smell of smoke filled the kitchen, and she realized with growing desperation that this was exactly what their enemies wanted, to drive them out into the open where they'd be easy targets. They're trying to burn us out, she gasped, stamping on a spark that had jumped to her nightgown. Not if I can help it, Jonathan said grimly, moving with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to violence. He grabbed his ammunition and headed for the back door. Keep the fire under control. I'm going to give them something else to think about. Jonathan, no! Rose called after him, but he was already gone, disappearing into the darkness beyond the house. The gunfire outside intensified, and Rose heard the distinctive crack of Jonathan's rifle from somewhere near the barn. The attackers were shouting now, their voices carrying confusion and anger as they found themselves caught between the house and an unexpected threat from behind. That's my boy, Hattie said with fierce pride, continuing to douse the last of the flames. leading them on a merry chase. He is—" Rose moved back to the window, straining to see what was happening in the yard. The darkness was absolute beyond the range of the muzzle flashes, but she could tell that the pattern of gunfire was changing. Instead of concentrating on the house, the attackers were now firing in multiple directions, trying to track Jonathan's movements. A new sound reached her ears, the thunder of approaching hoofbeats. For a moment, her heart sank, thinking that reinforcements had arrived for their attackers. But then she heard a familiar voice bellowing challenges in language that would have made a preacher blush, and she nearly cried with relief. "Elias," she breathed. The older man rode into the yard like an avenging angel, his rifle speaking with deadly accuracy as he sent the attackers scrambling for cover. Rose could see him now in the moonlight, sitting his horse with the ease of a born cavalryman, picking his targets with the cold precision of a man who'd fought in bigger wars than this. The tide of battle turned in moments. Caught between Jonathan's harassing fire from the barn, Elias's mounted assault, and the steady shooting from the house, the attackers found themselves outmaneuvered and outgunned. Rose watched through the window as dark figures began retreating toward the woods, dragging at least one wounded companion. "That's right," Hattie called after them, waving her pistol. "And don't come back!" The gunfire gradually died away, leaving only the ringing silence of a battlefield after the fighting ends. Rose found herself shaking now that the immediate danger was over, the delayed reaction setting in as adrenaline drained from her system. Jonathan appeared in the kitchen doorway, his face streaked with soot and sweat, but his eyes bright with something that might have been pride. "Everyone all right?" "We're fine," Rose said, then surprised herself by throwing her arms around him. He felt solid and warm and blessedly alive, and for a moment she allowed herself to simply hold him and be held in return. "They'll be back," Elias said grimly as he entered the house, his rifle still in his hands. "This was just a warning, a show of force. Caldwell's testing your resolve." "Then he has his answer," Rose said, pulling back from Jonathan but keeping one hand on his arm. "We don't scare easily." Jonathan looked at her with something approaching awe. "You could have been killed tonight. You should have been terrified." "I was terrified," Rose admitted. "But I was also angry, angrier than I've ever been in my life." She gestured around the damaged kitchen, at the broken glass and bullet holes that marked their home. "This is ours, Jonathan. We built it, we earned it, and we're not giving it up without a fight." "The question is," Elias said soberly, "what happens next? Caldwell's shown he's willing to use violence. This won't be the last time." Rose walked to the broken window and looked out at the yard where their enemies had stood just minutes before. Dawn was still hours away, but she could see the first faint lightening of the eastern sky. A new day was coming, and with it new challenges. "Then we'd better be ready for them," she said quietly, "because if Caldwell thinks he can drive us off our own land with threats and violence, he's about to learn just how wrong he is." She turned back to the two men, seeing her own determination reflected in their faces. They'd survived the first direct attack, but Rose knew it was only the beginning. Caldwell had crossed a line tonight, and there would be no going back for any of them. The war for North Valley had begun in earnest, and Rose Mallister intended to see it through to the end. The dawn sky bled crimson across the Montana Territory as Rose stood at the kitchen window of Silver Creek Ranch, watching the horizon with eyes that had learned to see danger in every shadow. 3 weeks had passed since the midnight attack. 3 weeks of uneasy quiet that felt more like the calm before a hurricane than any kind of peace. Jonathan emerged from the barn, his movements purposeful despite the early hour, even from a distance. Rose could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand never strayed far from the rifle he now carried everywhere. The attack had changed them all, but perhaps none more than her husband, who had been forced to accept that his quiet life of ranching was over. "Riders coming," Elias called from his position on the roof, where he'd been keeping watch since before sunrise. "A lot of them." Rose felt her stomach clench with familiar dread. But this time there was something else mixed with the fear. a cold anticipation that surprised her with its intensity. After weeks of waiting, of looking over their shoulders, of jumping at every sound, the final confrontation was finally at hand. She could see them now, a line of horsemen approaching across the valley floor like a dark tide. Even at this distance, she could make out the figure of Bartholomew Caldwell at their head, his silver hair catching the morning light as he rode with the confidence of a man who believed victory was already assured. "How many?" Jonathan asked as he reached the house, his voice steady despite the odds they faced. 15, maybe 20, Elias replied, climbing down from the roof with the agility of a much younger man. "All armed, all business?" Rose moved away from the window, her hands surprisingly steady as she checked the rifle that had become as familiar to her as any household tool. The woman who had arrived at Silver Creek Ranch with nothing but desperation and $3 to her name seemed like a stranger now, replaced by someone harder, more determined, willing to fight for what was hers. "They're not here to talk," she said quietly. "No," Jonathan agreed, his pale blue eyes hard as winter ice. "Caldwell's done with subtlety. This is his final play." Hattie appeared in the kitchen doorway, her weathered face grim but resolute. In her hands was her husband's old shotgun, the one that had seen her through Indian raids and claim jumpers and all the other perils of frontier life. "Been expecting this day for weeks," she said matter-of-factly. "Least now we know where we stand." The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, accompanied by the jingle of spurs and the creak of leather that spoke of men accustomed to violence. Rose positioned herself at the kitchen window, her rifle ready, while Jonathan took the front room and Elias covered the back of the house. "Mallister!" Caldwell's voice carried clearly across the yard, cultured and confident despite the early hour. "I've come to make you one final offer." Jonathan appeared in the doorway, his rifle held casually but ready. "I'm listening. Caldwell." $50,000 for the North Valley claim and the ranch. Caldwell sat his horse with the ease of a man born to command, surrounded by the gunman who had done his dirty work for so long. Cash money, enough to start over anywhere you choose. Rose felt a moment of genuine surprise. 50,000 was more money than most people saw in a lifetime. Enough to buy a new ranch, a new life, a fresh start far from the violence and threat that had consumed their days. "And if I refuse?" Jonathan called back. Caldwell's smile was visible even from a distance, cold and predatory. "Then I'm afraid you'll be leaving anyway. The only question is whether you leave rich or leave in a pine box." Rose moved closer to the window, studying the men who had come to drive them from their home. They were hard men, the kind who sold their guns to whoever paid best, but she could see uncertainty in some of their faces. Fighting a man defending his home was different from burning empty buildings in the night. "You've got 1 minute to decide, Mallister," Caldwell continued. "After that, we settle this the hard way." Jonathan looked back at Rose, and in that moment she saw everything he was thinking. The offer was real, the money enough to give them the life they'd dreamed of building here. All they had to do was surrender, abandon the land his father had died for, walk away from everything they'd fought to preserve. "What do you think?" he asked quietly. Rose felt the weight of the decision settling around her like a mantle. A few months ago, she would have taken the money without hesitation, would have seen it as deliverance from an impossible situation. But standing in the kitchen of the home she'd helped defend, looking out at the land she'd come to love, she found her answer came without doubt. "I think," she said, her voice carrying the steel that had been forged in fire and hardship, "that some things can't be bought." Jonathan's smile was like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. "I was hoping you'd say that." He turned back to the window, his voice ringing with certainty as he called out his answer. "Keep your money, Caldwell. This land isn't for sale." The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever, charged with the tension of a thunderstorm about to break. Then Caldwell raised his hand, and Rose knew that talk was over. "So be it," the silver-haired man called out. "Take them." The world exploded into violence. Caldwell's men spurred their horses forward, their rifles speaking with deadly purpose as they charged the ranch house. Rose found herself firing with a calm precision that would have astonished her former self, picking her targets with the careful deliberation of someone who understood that every shot mattered. The thunder of gunfire filled the air, punctuated by the screams of wounded horses and the shouts of men locked in mortal combat. Glass shattered and wood splintered as bullets tore through the walls of the house. But the solid construction that Jonathan's father had built held firm. Rose saw one of the attackers fall from his horse, clutching a wounded shoulder, and felt a fierce satisfaction that surprised her with its intensity. These men had come to steal everything she held dear, and she would make them pay for every inch of ground. "Got one coming around back," Elias shouted from the rear of the house, his rifle cracking like thunder. "Two more heading for the barn," Hattie called out, her shotgun booming as she fired both barrels at once. The battle swirled around the ranch house like a deadly dance, attackers falling back under the withering fire from the defenders only to regroup and charge again. Rose lost track of time in the chaos, her world narrowing to the mechanical process of loading, aiming, firing, loading again. Then she saw Jonathan break from the house, moving with the fluid grace of a born warrior as he rushed one of the gunmen who had gotten too close. The two men grappled for a moment before Jonathan's superior size and determination told, and his opponent went down hard. But the movement had exposed him, and Rose saw with horror as Caldwell himself spurred his horse forward, a gleaming revolver in his hand aimed squarely at her husband's back. "Jonathan!" she screamed, but knew her warning would come too late. Without thinking, Rose threw herself through the broken kitchen window, her rifle coming up even as she hit the ground hard enough to drive the breath from her lungs. The shot was impossible, a moving target at 50 yards while she was off balance and desperate. But desperation gave her aim a deadly accuracy. Caldwell's horse reared as the bullet took the man in the shoulder, spinning him around in the saddle. His own shot went wide, digging a furrow in the dirt where Jonathan had been standing moments before. The silver-haired man looked at Rose with something approaching respect, even as blood seeped through his expensive coat. "You're full of surprises, Mrs. Mallister," he said, his voice carrying pain but no defeat. "I'm full of fight," Rose replied, her rifle trained on his heart. "The question is whether you are." For a moment, the battle seemed to pause around them, attackers and defenders alike frozen by the tableau of the wounded Caldwell facing the woman who had brought him down. Then Caldwell slowly holstered his weapon, his face wearing an expression Rose had never seen there before, genuine admiration. "Boys," he called out, his voice carrying despite his injury. "Stand down." The gunfire gradually died away, leaving only the ringing silence of a battlefield after the storm. Several of Caldwell's men lay wounded in the dirt, and Rose could see that the fight had gone out of the rest. Facing determined defenders in their own home was different from the easy intimidation they were accustomed to. Jonathan moved to Rose's side, his own rifle ready but pointed downward. "It's over. Caldwell, take your men and get off my land." But Caldwell wasn't looking at Jonathan. His pale gray eyes were fixed on Rose with an expression that mixed respect, amusement, and something that might have been regret. "You know," he said conversationally, "I think I misjudged you, Mrs. Mallister, both of you, in fact." He winced as he shifted in his saddle, but his voice remained steady. "I've spent so many years dealing with men who could be bought or broken that I'd forgotten there were still people willing to fight for principle." "Some things are worth fighting for," Rose replied simply. Caldwell nodded slowly, as if coming to a decision that surprised even him. "Indeed they are." He looked around at his wounded men, at the ranch house that had withstood their assault, at the land that had been bought with blood and determination. "I concede, Mallister. North Valley is yours." The words hung in the morning air like a benediction. Rose felt something ease in her chest that she hadn't even realized was there, the constant tension of a woman under siege, the fear that had become so familiar she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be without it. "Just like that?" Jonathan asked, suspicion clear in his voice. "Just like that?" Caldwell's smile was rueful now, lacking the predatory edge it had always carried before. "I'm a businessman, and I know when to cut my losses. You've proven you're willing to die for this land, and that makes it more trouble than it's worth." He turned his horse toward the rising sun, then paused. "For what it's worth, Mrs. Mallister, you've earned my respect. That's not something I give lightly." "I don't want your respect," Rose said quietly. "I want your word that this is finished." "You have it." Caldwell touched his hat brim in a gesture that was almost courtly. "Good luck to you both. You're going to need it." As Caldwell and his remaining men rode away across the valley, Rose felt Jonathan's arm slip around her waist, anchoring her to the present moment. They stood together in the yard of their defended home, watching their enemies disappear into the distance. And Rose marveled at how much had changed since that first desperate day when she'd knocked on a stranger's door asking for work. "So," Jonathan said after the last rider had vanished over the horizon, "what do we do now?" Rose looked around at the ranch that had become her home, at the land they'd fought so hard to keep, at the man whose quiet strength had given her the courage to become someone she'd never imagined she could be. "Now," she said, we build the house in North Valley. We build the life we've earned. And we build something that will last long after we're gone." Jonathan's kiss was warm and full of promise, tasting of gunpowder and hope and the kind of love that was forged in fire and tested by adversity. When they finally broke apart, Rose saw in his pale blue eyes the same determination that had carried them through every trial. "Think we can do it?" he asked. "Build something that lasts?" Rose looked out over the valley that stretched before them, golden in the morning light, full of possibility and promise. In the distance, she could see the site where their new house would rise, where their children might someday play, where the dream that had cost them so much would finally take root and flourish. "I know we can," she said with absolute certainty. "We've already started." As the sun climbed higher into the Montana sky, Rose and Jonathan Mallister walked hand in hand toward their future, leaving behind the woman who had arrived with nothing and the man who had offered marriage to a stranger. In their place stood partners who had been tested by fire and found worthy of each other, ready to build not just a house, but a legacy that would endure long after the last echoes of gunfire had faded from North Valley. The war was over. The real work was just beginning.